The Public Policy Event Series has become a signature event for Commerce Lexington, and these events would not be possible without our committed sponsors. Their support ensures that we're able to offer you these first-rate events. You'll see the sponsors displayed on the banners and at the back of your program. We'd like to particularly thank Kentucky American Water for being our presenting sponsor for this policy event series. I'd like to invite Jimmy Keaton, representing Kentucky American, to the podium for some sponsor remarks.
Good morning. Once again, it's a pleasure for Kentucky American Water to welcome all of you to today's Public Policy Breakfast. We extend special greetings to Senator Paul. And Senator, we appreciate all you do for the Commonwealth and our great nation. Kentucky American Water is proud to support this series and proud to be a regional water service provider. With our recent acquisition of the Ridgewood wastewater system located in Franklin County, effective October 7, we will serve portions of 12 counties in Kentucky. For those of you who don't know, we are a subsidiary of American Water, the largest water and wastewater utility in the United States, with over 6,800 employees serving more than 3.5 million homes, operating more than 600 treatment plants across the country, and serving a dozen U.S. military bases. Our employees are dedicated professionals committed to customer service, operational excellence, and they do an outstanding job delivering high quality, reliable drinking water to our customers every single day. So on behalf of our employees of Kentucky American Water, headquartered in Lexington, we appreciate the opportunity to serve as sponsor, and Senator, we look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Jimmy, and thanks again to Kentucky American Water. Elected to the United States Senate in 2010, Dr. Paul is an outspoken champion for constitutional liberties and fiscal responsibility. He is a fierce opponent to government overreach and has worked to return government to its limited constitutional scope. A dedicated physician, Dr. Paul owned his own ophthalmology practice and performed eye surgery for 18 years. Dr. Paul is a devoted husband and father of 3, living with his family in Bowling Green. His entrance into politics is indicative of his life's work as a surgeon, a desire to diagnose problems and provide practical solutions, whether it be in Kentucky or Washington, D.C. Here to give us an update on his work in Washington, as well as the U.S. Senate race and issues important to the business community, is Senator Rand Paul.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me this morning. Often I'm asked, why can't you guys just get along? You know, why can't you men and women get along, maybe hold hands, sing Kumbaya? Can't you guys just get along and get something done? And people have this sort of, it's kind of like, you know, if someone talks to you about the 1950s, oh, it was so great in the 1950s. Well, they forgot about a few things, segregation, other things like that. It wasn't perfect in the 1950s. But people think Congress at one time, it was perfect and everybody got along and everybody was singing Kumbaya and we had no gridlock and everything was getting done. So I sit at Henry Clay's desk and I decided to learn more about Henry Clay. So Henry Clay started out in Frankfort as a young man. He was probably about 23, 24 years old when he was elected to the Assembly. And protectionism, they were angry at Britain at the time. It was about 1808 or so. They had passed laws, and he was the chief architect of this, saying you cannot wear in the legislature any clothes made in Britain or in Europe. And so they're all wearing their American homespun, and some guy shows up that opposed his bill, wearing all his garish, outlandish British attire, and they have words. And the words get vicious, and finally Henry Clay says, enough's enough. We're going to cross the Ohio and take care of this man-to-man with a duel. So he became very famous. He was wounded in the duel, but his first act was actually fighting someone in the legislature over clothing. You know, we think things are petty now. Crossing the Ohio in Louisville and having a duel, getting wounded, and his celebrity actually increased from dueling. And so then he gets to Washington, and he serves in the Senate for a very short period of time, but then he serves in the House. And in his first term, becomes Speaker of the House. It's never ever happened before or since, but he becomes Speaker of the House. It was a very unruly place. The Derringer, the small pistol, had been invented, and most people carried one on the floor. There was a guy named John Randolph of Roanoke, and he had two big hunting dogs. Now, when you think of hunting dogs, don't think of Labrador retrievers. Think of those dogs in the Game of Thrones. Anybody watch the Game of Thrones? All right, these were mean, nasty dogs. And one time a debt collector came to John Randolph's house, and as he's sitting there, and he said, "It's only because of your genteel nature that my dogs don't rip you to pieces." All right? So he would bring these dogs on the floor, and the Speaker of the House before, Henry Clay, was afraid to get rid of them. And Henry Clay came there, and he says, "Tell the sergeant at arms, tell him to remove the dogs." And the last time someone had challenged John Randolph over his dogs, he had beat them over the head with a cane. So there were guns, there were canes, and there were fist fights on the floor of the House. So anyway, Speaker Henry Clay says, "Remove the dogs." The dogs are removed, and John Randolph is steaming. And as he exits the chamber, he's there waiting as Henry Clay finally exits the chamber, and he says, "I never sidestep a skunk." And Henry Clay said, "I always do," and walked right around it. And so it hasn't always really been, what you think it was. John Randolph and Henry Clay's feud goes on probably for 15, 16 more years. Henry Clay runs for president in 1824, but gets fourth place. I know the feeling. I was a little lower than that, but so he gets fourth place, and Andrew Jackson wins the majority of the electoral votes, wins a plurality, but not a majority, so it gets thrown into the House. Henry Clay makes a deal with John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams becomes president, and Jackson is really miffed, and so are all of his supporters. So they say, Henry Clay made a corrupt bargain. He basically sold himself to become Secretary of State. So John Randolph's on the floor 15 years after they've had their sort of first feud over his dogs, and John Randolph, they say, gives the most hateful, venomous, poisonous speech ever on the Senate floor, and concludes by saying this is a corrupt bargain, and Henry Clay is nothing more than a blackleg. I didn't know what a blackleg was, but apparently a blackleg is someone who cheats in cards. And Henry Clay was known for drinking, card playing, and maybe a little bit of womanizing, but he did, and that was okay, but he wasn't a cheater, all right? And so he was pretty mad about being called a cheater at cards, so he challenges John Randolph to a duel. They cross the Potomac, and John Randolph shows up that morning wearing a flowing evening gown or morning gown. Men used to wear these big, long, like you'd see a baby christened in, this big, long, full-length gown. And it wasn't really appropriate to wear that because you couldn't see where he was underneath the gown. It was a weird thing to do, and John Randolph was a weird guy anyway. So they have a duel, and Henry Clay shoots him twice, but just goes through the big flowing gown and misses his body. The point is, man, the Congress has been much worse than it is today. And the point isn't that it's perfect now, but it's interesting how history remembers Henry Clay. They remember him as the great compromiser. A guy fights two duels and seems to be brawling it up and was called the little dictator of the House, and now we remember him as the great compromiser. But I think there is, and one of the underreported things about Congress is that there is compromise happening, and there's bipartisanship happening all the time. You just have to look for it. Part of the reason you don't see it is we live in a world where the media wants to report contention as opposed to conciliation. So for example, if you watch your evening news every night, 20-30% of the broadcast will be violence and crime. And yet it's about 1% to 2% of the public committing crimes, and 1% to 2% of the time. Most of us live our entire life free of crime. I'm not saying there's no crime, but I think there's a disproportionate amount of it on the media. Same way with the reporting of Congress. It seems to me it's all contention. I've never had a crossword with a Democrat up there. I'm not just saying that. I have had a crossword with a Republican or two. And so actually the words that I've seen more heated have been sort of within the family, within the caucus of the Republican Party. But as far as bipartisanship, most people who are trying to get a bill done actually try to get somebody on the other side. And so when we have issues that don't seem to be that partisan, or when we have an issue where we can find a part of the issue that's not partisan, we actually are able to get some things done. This summer, the discussion over the heroin outbreak has consumed not only people in Kentucky, but New Hampshire, Ohio, many different states, and we actually did get something done. Wasn't very partisan. Republicans and Democrats both supported it. We worked to get a provision in it that was actually included in the final legislation, and that was to expand the amount of patients that doctors could see who need treatment. And so I think we do get together and do things. And 2 weeks before I came down here, or 2 weeks ago now, before we left session, I worked with Chris Murphy. And I think you'll find that people work together who don't agree on a lot, but find a point of agreement. He and I don't agree on gun control. He's the leading face of gun control. But he is also somebody who agrees with me that we shouldn't continue blithely selling arms to Saudi Arabia, that we're in the middle of a war in Yemen now, and most of the American public doesn't know it. American jets are refueling Saudi bombers, we're providing the bombs, and we're picking the targets in Yemen. How many people here knew we were at war in Yemen? If you were refueling the planes, picking the targets, and you have people on the ground, you are at war. Shouldn't we have a debate over this? The Constitution says that the authority to go to war comes from Congress. I mean, they were very explicit. They discussed this ad nauseum. Every one of the founding fathers was in agreement. It was one of these powers they were going to take away from the king, and it was one of these powers they were worried they did not want the president to have this unilateral authority. We're supposed to have a debate. Why? Because just to say something is in our national interest is a conclusion, but certainly there ought to be a debate. And if you want to talk about great ironies, during the debate over whether or not we should provide bombs, more bombs for Saudi Arabia, we also passed legislation saying that the 9/11 victims can sue Saudi Arabia for involvement in 9/11. So at the same time, the vast majority of Congress and the Senate thinks that they have some suspicion Saudi Arabia was involved in 9/11, we're still selling them bombs. During President Obama's administration, he sold $100 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. The one thing that is for sure as you travel throughout the Middle East is that you will see U.S. weapons, often on both sides of the equation. The other day when Turkey invaded into Syria, they rolled in with U.S. tanks. Who was the first people they encountered and the first people they decided to fight? The Kurds, with our weapons. The other day, just north of Aleppo, there's a little town called Morea. In that town, you had Pentagon-backed Kurds fighting CIA-backed Syrian moderates. We're on both sides of often the battles and the wars throughout there. Why are we giving Saudi Arabia all these weapons or selling them? Because they're worried that Iran's getting stronger. How's Iran getting stronger? We released, $100 billion that they're now using to buy conventional weapons. It sounds like an arms race, and we're right in the middle of all of it. We have a refugee crisis over there because of a war. Everybody's like, where do you put the refugees? Well, why don't we try to have less war? Why don't we try to figure out an arrangement to the war? Why don't we try to figure out some kind of end to this? How did the war start? The war started from a misguided notion. And the other night, in that presidential debate, Trump got sidetracked on was he for or against it on the Howard Stern show. My goodness. The whole point is, whether you were for or against the Iraq War, have we learned anything from the Iraq War? Did we learn a lesson from the Iraq War? Here's the lesson I learned, that when you get rid of a secular dictator, someone who's been an iron fist in that area, you get chaos. And if you're hopeful they're going to elect Thomas Jefferson over there, you're foolish, misguided, and naive. Thomas Jefferson doesn't exist over there. One of the miracles of the American Revolution was that we didn't descend into chaos. Why? Because we kept our religion, we kept our common law, and we had a 600-year history of assembly and of trying to limit the power of the king. See, this wasn't just America. In England, from Magna Carta on, 1215 on, there was this movement to limit the king. The Middle East knows none of that. They know despot to despot, and that's usually what happens. But as we toppled Hussein, you got a vacuum. In that power vacuum, you had chaos. We won the war, and yet the people who took over are more friendly now with Iran than they are us. You got a sectarian government. It's all Shiites that run the government. They booted the Sunnis out of the government. They booted the Sunnis out of the army. So what happened when ISIS rolled in? Some of them said, well, ISIS is they're part of our religion, and maybe we'll see how they are, but we know we hate the people in Baghdad and we hate the Iranians. So all of the areas occupied by ISIS are Sunni areas. And so you have sort of this chaos that came from getting rid of a dictator or a despot in Hussein. But that should be the lesson we should learn. But who has been the biggest advocates of toppling Assad in Syria, toppling Mubarak in Egypt, or toppling Gaddafi in Libya? Hillary Clinton, John McCain. You say, oh, they're different. They're the opposite. No, they're the same. It's the same failed foreign policy that says that we should always intervene and it's always our job to intervene. Problem is, none of them seem to be learning the lesson of unintended consequences. The unintended consequences of pushing Assad back have been that ISIS grew stronger. ISIS rides around in $1 billion worth of our Humvees. We didn't give them to them, but they simply took them. So when we flood weapons into there, we need to know who our friends are. Frankly, the Kurds are our friends, but we don't give weapons directly to the Kurds. We give them to the Shiite government in Baghdad, who doles them out sparingly to the Kurds. ISIS is about 25,000 people, 25,000 soldiers. The Turks have 600,000. The Peshmerga have about 190,000. Baghdad government has about 190,000. Jordanians have a couple 100,000, and the Israelis have 1 million. They're surrounded. We can't beat 25,000 people. Somehow we think American troops have to do this. If we send American troops back into the Middle East, let's say we send 100,000 troops back, how long will it take to defeat ISIS? 3 days probably, because they will simply run. They're not going to fight us in a contested battle. But if we do that, have we won the war, or have they slithered off into the shadows only to come back? This is an ideology. It's an aberration. And there have been people who've written about this. Thomas Friedman, I don't agree on a lot, but he talked about the idea of containment and amplification of our allies. Let's amplify our allies, but ultimately let's see if civilized Islam, with some help maybe, can defeat this aberration. The reason is that if you want an ultimate victory and an ultimate peace, they look at us and they say, we're pagans, we're the evil Satan, you know. We are not somebody they're going to accept defeat from. They have to ultimately be defeated by their co-religionists, by other people of the Islamic faith. And Islam needs to do this also to show that this doesn't represent their faith. But it's a big deal, and to me it's a big deal that we not get involved in war without first having a debate in Congress and first having a vote. There's a young captain in the military right now who's suing over taking an order because it says in the military justice or in the armed services manual that you don't have to obey, you know, your first oath is to the Constitution. You don't have to obey an unlawful order. Well, he doesn't know whether it is or isn't, so he's suing in court to find out. I don't know if the court will hear him, but it's a reasonable question. We should debate these things. I had a conversation with President Obama directly on this about 1.5 years ago when he started unleashed the bombs that he and Hillary Clinton supported in Libya. I said, one of the things I liked about President Obama was that when he ran in 2007, he said, no president should unilaterally go to war without the authority of Congress, unless we're under imminent attack. And I agree with that. I mean, if people are launching missiles at us, the president has the right to respond immediately. You have to have that. That's an unusual circumstance. And when we've been attacked, most presidents have come almost immediately, or they used to historically. When we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, within a day, I think the next day, FDR asked for a declaration of war and Congress gave it to him unanimously. When we were attacked on 9/11, I think it took a few weeks till we actually did a declaration of war or initiation of force, but we voted nearly unanimously in 9/11. So we have to do this because, one, war is a terrible thing. You know, war shouldn't be entered into, you know, without full thought and full discussion. It should be the last resort, not the first resort. And really, when I look at my job, I think it's the most important thing I do is trying to make the decision whether we go to war or not, and thinking about our soldiers and what they will suffer and have suffered. One young man in the neighboring town in Bowling Green that my wife and I and others helped build a house, he lost both legs and an arm. And so when he went to war, he fought for us, for the Bill of Rights, for the Constitution. You know, I can't have enough respect for that, but it's also our job while they're gone to defend the Constitution and not to be so fearful of 25,000 people that we give up our liberty while they're gone. You know, some say, well, we can't catch those terrorists. We can't catch them unless we give up our liberty. Unless we let the government look at all of our phone information, we can't stop them. I don't think that's true. I think the Constitution does work. I think warrants work. Ask any of the judges here in the community how often they turn down warrants. Warrants are most of the time granted. If someone is out and about 3 in the morning and they think there's a rapist in a house and the police call the judge, how often do you think the judge says no? Almost never. And I'm for the judge saying to go in, but I'm also for the step of the police actually calling the judge. Police all obey the Fourth Amendment. There's not one policeman in your community that will go into a house without permission. If they do, the evidence won't be used and it won't be worthwhile. So I think we can have our liberty, can have the Constitution, and can also at the same time defend ourselves from terrorism. As far as what are we doing with domestic policy, I would say the biggest problem we still face is our debt. And in some ways, I think it's interconnected with national security. You can't be a strong nation. You can't defend yourself if you're wallowing in debt. We have a $20 trillion debt. We borrow $1 million a minute. And Admiral Mullen said that the greatest threat to our national security is actually our debt. I think that's true. I think you can get to the point where you're overextended to such a degree that you're not able to defend yourself. And we do have to worry about that. So I put out weekly a waste report. Anybody who wants to be on that can sign up through our official government account. And we put out a waste report to tell people, you know what, there is a lot of waste. I put forward a bill to give government employees bonuses if they'll find savings. We right now have the opposite. When you get to the last month of the fiscal year, government employees spend money 5 times faster than any other month. It's called use it or lose it, because if you've got a $12 million budget and you only spend $11 million, they might not give you the full budget the next year, so you're just like, well, I might as well spend the whole $12 million. That's why you see conferences in Las Vegas in the last month of the year, and the money spent 5 times faster. In fact, the money gets spent faster as the day goes on. On September 30th, when the doors open on the East Coast, the spending begins, and it's a flurry of spending. As you go across the continent, it's chasing the sun. At 5 o'clock in California, they're spending the money as rapidly as they can. They're shoveling it out the door, and you'd be amazed at what it's spent on. So I've tried to give the reverse incentive. I think they have a perverse incentive now. I've tried to give them the same incentive you have in business to say, you know what? If you save money for your boss, you'll probably get a bonus. You'll at least get a pat on the back. Luther, I'm sure, would give you a bonus if you save money for him. But I think that we need to look at ways to reform it and not do the same old, same old. If we say, well, are there, I said we get along quite a bit. Are there partisan differences? Sure there are. And it's almost, I think, universal. There are, and I hate to be frank about this, there are no Democrats for reducing regulations in Washington. Dodd-Frank, Republicans would almost uniformly repeal the Dodd-Frank banking regulations, or at the very least repeal as many as we could. We don't have one vote in the Senate from Democrats to do that. On taxes, we would lower taxes. We want a smaller federal government, and we want more money left in Lexington. There's not one Democrat in Washington that will lower taxes. They're so worried and concerned about making sure people are adequately punished and people are paying more in taxes. Let's get those rich people. The rich people pay the taxes. The top 1% pay a third of the income tax. The top 10% pay 60% of the income tax. These are just facts. And the thing is do we not understand that coveting our neighbor's property isn't a good feeling, isn't something that's good for us? What we should be spreading is this gospel of hope to every young kid out there that you could be Bill Gates. You could be a success if you work hard in school. But it shouldn't be that we're spreading this philosophy of your neighbor has 3 cars, send the government to get one of their cars from them. The politics of envy is not a good thing. We shouldn't say the pie's this big, go grab what you can now, send your representative to get what you can from other people. No, let's make the pie this big. We've done it before. When we did it under Reagan, it was reduction of taxes. We didn't shrink government, we should have, so the debt did increase, but we should do both. Shrink government size, shrink the tax rates, and let's see if we can prosper. Reagan took the rates from 90% personal to 70, from 70 to 50, and from 50 to 28. But now we've been creeping the other way. We're up to about, the top 1% are paying about 44% before you get to their state tax. 44%, is that not enough? Maybe we ought to look at whether we have too much government before we say we want to just stick it to rich people or stick it to corporations. It is not healthy to say we want to punish corporations. Do you know who owns corporations? Teachers, firemen, policemen. I always kind of joke that I'm not in a organization that has a pension. I'm not rich enough, so I can't get in one of these private equity funds. but they own Apple Computer. They own all of our corporations. You may not own a lot of it, but if you're a teacher, you own some of Apple. We don't want to punish Apple. We don't want to punish corporations so they leave our country. We have the highest corporate income tax in the world, 35%. I'd lower it to 15 or below immediately. Canada's 15, Ireland's 12. There's not one Democrat that'll do that for us. And I hate to make it partisan, but I want you to know what happens in Washington. There is a partisan divide on taxes. There is a partisan divide on regulations. It's not just the war on coal, which is unanimously done by Democrats in Washington. It's not just the war on the family farm, which is Waters of the U.S., which is now having the federal government regulate the farm in Kentucky. That's unanimously the other party. The war on the banks, the same thing. The war on hospitals, the war on doctors. All of the regulatory war is coming from one side in this country. So you have to decide if that's what you want. It's going to be a shrinking pie. Go grab what you can and elect people who grab some for you. But that's not what I want. I want to protect your liberty. I want you to be free, and I want you to prosper. Every community I go to in Kentucky, I say, what is your business? What can I do to allow you to make more money? And it's like, why? Is it because I like rich people? No, I want the people who own the businesses to hire people. I want everybody to prosper. And it isn't a zero-sum game. It isn't if my neighbor prospers, I won't. We can all prosper if we realize and value the system that our founding fathers gave us. We are the richest, the freest, and the most humanitarian country ever in the history of mankind. In 2014, we gave away, not the government, but you as individuals gave away nearly $400 billion in charity. $400 billion to your churches and charities. That doesn't happen in Cuba. Doesn't happen in Venezuela. We have candidates. The main candidate opposite Hillary Clinton on the other side was for socialism. He calls it democratic socialism, but socialism's an utter failure in history. Socialism leads to poverty, and it inherently involves violence and death. It's not an accident that Stalin killed 37 million people, Mao killed 60 million people, Pol Pot killed 10 million people. When you give too much power to one person, and that's what socialism is, inevitably it leads to tragedy. It was Madison who said that where power resides, there lies the greatest danger. To me, it's about trying to decentralize power, bring power back to the states, bring power back to the local community, bring power to the individual. But we need to divide it up and understand that the concentration of power in Washington is too great, whether it's in Republican or Democrat hands. And no matter who is elected, if there's a Republican elected in November, you'll find that I will be critical of too much power wherever it resides. And I'm running for re-election. If you'll have me again, I'm going to keep trying to defend your liberty, keep taxes low, balance the budget, and defend the Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Paul. We have time for some questions, and if you have some, if you could just maybe hold them up, and Andy'll come get them. But just to kind of kick us off, talk a little bit about the economy, and it's the #1 issue in this election season, and we're seeing 1% to 2% economic growth. Is that the new normal, or do you think there are some things that could be done to get economic growth back up to where we'd like it to be?
Well, if you're in a business, you have the cost of doing business, things you buy, your labor, et cetera. Well, two costs of doing business that are governmental are taxes and regulation. You have a $3 trillion tax burden every year, and you have a $2 trillion regulatory burden. And so the regulatory burden we've got to do something about, and the tax burden. We have to be competitive with other countries. We're growing at about 1%, but part of the reason we're languishing is corporations want to leave our country. And so that's why we have to be very, very careful about this. I hate American corporations, and I hate American business group of people, because if we succumb to that, sort of this politics of class warfare, those companies will simply leave. Burger King reincorporated in Canada. New software startup companies are going to Canada because it's a 15% tax up there. Ireland's 12%. So we do have to be concerned about it. 1% should not be the new normal. 3% was what we had sort of on average. In one of Reagan's years, we had 7% nominal growth, though. So we can grow even more rapidly. For each percentage point of growth, it's about 1 million jobs. So we're about 2 million jobs shy. We also have a whole host of young people graduating from college with college debt who either aren't getting the job they want or aren't getting a job that pays what they want, but that's an underperforming economy. But that's a debate you have as a people. Do you think that you grow more if we raise taxes? Do you think you'll grow more if we have more regulations? And really, it's a pendulum. Nobody's talking about no taxes. Nobody's talking about no regulation. We're talking about what is reasonable. And I think if reasonable is here, I think we're way over here on the unreasonable side as far as regulations. You know, look at what the goal of President Obama and Hillary Clinton have been on coal. Their goal on coal was not health and safety, it was bankruptcy. President Obama said he would bankrupt coal, and he's almost done it. Hillary Clinton said we're going to put your miners out of business. You know, so I think we have to decide what is the role of government. Can we have some regulation? Sure. I'm not against some regulations on the smokestack. We've had some for 50 years, and the emissions on the smokestack have gone out for 50 years for coal. So, but we just can't go over the top, and right now I think we're over the top on the regulatory burden.
You touched a little bit on this with the combination of the EPA policies and the decline in Kentucky coal have led to some uncertainty and some concern about what our future coal electric prices will be in Kentucky. What do you think Washington can do to help ensure that Kentucky maintains affordable electricity prices for residents, but also for our manufacturing that depends so much on electricity?
I would repeal all of President Obama's war on coal regulations. That's the first thing we ought to do. And I think you'd then see competitive prices here again in Kentucky. But the bigger problem, other than just coal, is that the regulatory agencies have become a fiefdom or like a kingdom unto themselves. And so with the banking regulations, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, we don't even fund it. Congress doesn't fund it. When they come to testify to us, they simply laugh if we ask them questions because we can't do anything to them. We can't defund them. We can't do anything to try to modulate their behavior. They're completely independent of Congress. That's a problem. They get their money from the Federal Reserve, and there's already an arrogance and officialdom and overwrought and overwhelming regulations coming from them, and they've just been in business a couple of years. If we get 8 years of Clinton and a CFPB without any kind of congressional oversight, I shudder to think what happens in the end. But the EPA, the same thing. So this clean power plant thing, that regulation they passed on utilities, that was done without our permission, without a vote of Congress. And so it's thousands of pages long. Immigration law, which the court stopped yesterday, President Obama, and we can, I'm very open to the discussion on immigration. We can figure out an immigration policy for our country, but it shouldn't be done by one person. President Obama decided that 4 to 5 million people would not be under the immigration law that currently says what they've done is illegal in coming to the country. Well, you just can't do that. We can debate whether we want that as a people, but he should not be allowed to do that on his own. That's what's going on with the regulatory war, is they're doing whatever they want. So it used to be co-equal branches of government, and Madison said we'd pit ambition against ambition, so we'd have checks and balances. Now the presidency's 1,000-fold greater than Congress. And that's the regulatory agencies are under the president. Didn't happen just with this president. Republicans have done it also. We need to rebalance the power equation in Washington and make the branches co-equal again.
We have a few audience questions.
All right?
First question. Is this on?
You want to try here?
Now? It wasn't? Healthcare costs are getting out of control. What are we doing to reduce healthcare costs for small and medium-sized businesses?
I practiced medicine for 20 years, and I found that the biggest complaint I always got was the rising cost of insurance. It was rising rapidly, more rapidly than inflation. So we had two problems. And this was under the old system, we had cost and we had access. Obamacare tried to assess access, and so they did increase access with some costs. It now costs more if you're paying for your insurance because you're paying for those who are not paying. So the individual market has shrunk some, fewer people supplying that insurance, and so the price is skyrocketing. So of the two problems, we made the cost problem worse, and of the access problem, we kind of improved it. However, even that has problems. So if you're getting subsidized insurance under the Affordable Care Act, but you have a $6,000 deductible, my guess is you may still be a non-payer. But you think you've got an insurance card, so you're probably going to the doctor and to the hospital more, because I've got my insurance card, and yet you're getting there and you're still unable to pay because the prices have risen and your deductible $6,000. So I think that really we haven't fixed the problem. Part of the problem with healthcare is that we should look at it as an economics problem, not as a wonky sort of special healthcare problem. It's simply economics. We don't have a shortage of iPads. We don't have a shortage of iPhones. Why should we have a shortage of healthcare? There are aspects of healthcare that are not covered by insurance and not covered by the government, and the price typically goes down. LASIK surgery, when I started doing LASIK surgery to get rid of glasses, it's about $2,500 an eye. It's now $250 an eye. Competition works. The laser still costs, $500,000 to $1 million, and they're able to do it for $250 an eye. The marketplace will work if we'd let it work. Contact lenses are much less expensive, but you can probably get them for almost a couple of dollars a piece. My price in my office was the same as Walmart's. Not because I really cared to make it the same as Walmart's, I had to. Competition works. So really what you need is a marketplace. In the ideal health insurance world, when your child is born, you'd buy you'd start an HSA for them, and if they don't get significantly sick, you'd put more money in each year, and your goal should be, I want to get the largest possible deduction I can possibly get, but I want the cheapest premiums. Under Obamacare, you got large deductibles and large premiums because he mandated about 10 different items that all insurance have to have these 10 different items. So if there are mandates, that's not really a high deductible, that's a low deductible because you mandate from $1, 10 items, it's going to be more expensive. So what we have to do is understand a little bit of how capitalism works everywhere else to distribute goods. The most goods at the cheapest price is freedom of exchange, free transactions, and you let people trade. But we have a system where government's so involved, we probably have to stepwise go towards that. But I think we could. It would be health savings accounts, higher deductibles, but cheaper premiums.
Kind of a related question. There have been some stories in recent days about health insurance companies dropping coverage. It's happened here in Kentucky and it's happening across the country. And the thought is that the Affordable Care Act as it stands right now is not sustainable. If there aren't the votes to do something completely different, do you see any kind of fix that would happen to bring insurers back to the market?
No, I mean, it's a terrible system. And so probably half the country has one supplier of insurance now. What's going to happen in that marketplace? Prices are going to go through the roof as you have not a natural monopoly, but sort of a government-created monopoly. No, they've destroyed the marketplace. The only way to get it back is to try to lift the controls and allow the marketplace to operate again. But I think of the co-ops that they set up, 17 out of 24 went bankrupt. 1 million people have lost their coverage. The individual market, you're seeing 50 and 60% increases in premiums. So I don't see anything good about it. I think we should scrap the whole system and start over. There aren't the votes for it. It's absolutely partisan. I'll now tell you how partisan it is. Let's say you think, well, there's some good, let's keep some good, and let's just fix the bad. Susan Collins, who's a very practical senator, introduced one to say that, you know what, let's take the mandate on buying insurance and not make it 30 hours, make it 40 hours. Most people think of 40 hours being full-time, but if you mandate it at 30 hours, what happens is the person working in the fast food restaurant at 32 hours now works 28 hours. And so the CBO added that up, and they said it was the equivalent of over 2 million job hours were lost by people reducing hours so they didn't have to provide insurance. So I think there are ways that we could change that, even that small item. There's like maybe 2 or 3 Democrats that'll vote for that. And Harry Reid steadfastly blocked any kind of vote on just that one little change. And so we have to have a discussion, and I think we have to get beyond. Right now we have this discussion that seems to be one side cares about the poor, other side doesn't. But look, I care as much as any Democrat about the poor. I just don't think their programs are working. So I want health care for everybody. I want lower costs for everybody. But I want to look at the system that's completely broken, and let's look at the marketplace that provides, an abundance of things at a cheap price. I think we just need to embrace capitalism.
The millennial vote is, again, in hot pursuit by both parties this election. How can Donald Trump and the Republican Party convince this generation that the GOP is not broken but is the right choice?
Stop talking about Miss Universe. You know, I talked to a lot of young groups. We were at Eastern yesterday, and we had 150 kids at Eastern. I was at Western earlier in the day, and we had over 200 kids there. I think kids aren't as concerned with taxes and regulation. This is a group of people in business. Y'all are concerned about your businesses. If you're a kid, you don't have anything, you probably got debt. So you're concerned about your college debt, but you're also concerned about your personal liberty. And if you've got kids, you know, sometimes we communicate with them by text message when they're in the basement. So they do a lot of communication by their phone. They don't want the government, or really frankly you, to look at their phone. And so I think the idea of personal liberty resonates with young people, and the idea that a government shouldn't be involved in our, you know, our private lives for the most part. And then on college debt, I think they're smarter than we give them credit for. I asked 200 of them at Western yesterday to raise their hand if they thought we should have free college, and only about 3 did. And one guy was a professor from a hippie from the 70s who thought we should have free college. But it makes no sense. Somebody's got to pay for it. I think we should be debating why does college cost so much and how do we bring the price down, which once again is a competition kind of argument. And I'd also let kids deduct their college. Not only the interest, I'd let them deduct the principal, because I think it's a lifelong business decision to go to college. So I think we could do more to help kids. But we also ought to bring the price of education down by allowing more competition.
How do you think the U.S. should handle the Syrian refugee crisis?
I think the first thing we should do is not try to make the crisis worse. You know, so we have to be aware that the Syrian civil war has created this. I don't know if we can necessarily magically make it go away. I do think that the surrounding countries should be the first refuge. Saudi Arabia has taken 0 Syrian refugees. Qatar, 0. United Arab Emirates, 0. Why aren't they taking any refugees? And look, I'm not completely against saying we can take people to our country. Our church helped bring one of the first Bosnian families to Bowling Green, you know, and I'm proud of that. We have many good Bosnians now in Bowling Green. They've assimilated well, and they're good people. They own restaurants, and they're hardworking. But I'm not for having millions of people come in here without adequate screening either. So I think that the first thing that needs to be done is let's try to resolve the war. Second thing, let's make sure the surrounding countries are full of refugees, and then let's see what we can do. But we have to have some care. I mean, we had 2 refugees come to Bowling Green, and they immediately tried to buy Stinger missiles to attack us. So I think we can't completely say there's no risk from refugees. And then the only other thing I'd say about the refugee program is if you're a big supporter of this and you want to help, by all means do, but do it with your money. You know, I don't think we should immediately bring people here from other countries and put them in government housing. You know, we have a lot of poor people in our country, so we're going to import people, put them all on welfare, and put them in government housing. You know, the Statue of Liberty says, bring me your poor and your huddled masses. They all came to work. My wife's grandmother came here as a maid. She worked for 40 years as a maid, but she knew if she didn't work, she was going to be sent back to Ireland. And it used to be more harsh not harsh, but more exacting circumstances that people had to come here to work, and the opportunity was to work. And I'm still for that. And I'm trying to, you know, improve the migrant worker program for farming, because I think we need the workers, frankly. So I'm not against people coming to the country, but it needs to be for work. And then we also need to think of the bigger picture of how we don't create more refugees in that war.
Guns have been an issue that has been brought up not just in society but on Capitol Hill. And one of the pieces of legislation was to prohibit anybody on the no-fly list from owning a gun. Could you talk a little bit about your philosophy on that particular issue and just in general?
Yeah. There were sort of 2 alternatives. Democrats wanted to say everybody on the no-fly list would not be able to have a gun. We wanted to say if you're on the no-fly list, you would be, if you tried to buy a gun, you would be prevented, but you would have a court case proceeding before your rights were taken away from you. It's your Second Amendment right. It's in the Bill of Rights. We just think that there are mistakes making on the list. The list is secret, the criteria for being on the list. So it's kind of hard to imagine we're going to give up one of our Bill of Rights through a criteria where they don't explain to us or tell us what the criteria is for being on the list. I think none of us want terrorists to have guns. None of us want felons to have guns, frankly. So we are for abbreviating people's rights who have had them taken away by a court, by a jury. But there needs to be some kind of process. There are people, Ted Kennedy was on the no-fly list, you know, I mean, people mistakenly get on there. My chief of staff was on there for a while getting a secure, and maybe he needed to be, but, you know, the thing is that there needs to be, when you're going to take away someone's rights, there needs to be a court case, but it isn't about one side wanting to take away guns from terrorists and the other not. It's both of us wanting to, but us wanting to have a court proceeding before they take away your rights.
Final question is a political one. Where do you see the Senate shaking out come Election Day in terms of Republicans retaining control?
You know, a month ago, I would say there was a reasonable chance the Democrats were going to take control. Now I would say it's 50-50, but maybe leans a little bit towards Republicans taking control. There are probably about 5 seats that are dead even, and those seats could go either way. And so I think we'll be up watching the electoral returns, and I think the presidential race plays into that. You know, what happens over the next couple presidential debates, and whether or not we can quit talking about Miss Universe.
Senator Paul, thanks so
Thank
much
you.
for your time.
Thanks. Enjoyed it. Thanks. Thanks.